help us.
Thanks. Mark? They want you up there. You're being streamed.
Okay, I'll do it then. All right. Well, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning, particularly given the fact that we have several states around that are facing impending disaster with this hurricane. It's hard for me to get it off my mind, just that all that we're doing, and I just feel compelled just to kind of open with a little bit of prayer. Father, I just pray for this hurricane and the people that are in its path. May they get out, may they be safe, may their property be protected, but more importantly, their lives. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys, we're going to, my job this morning is to, hold on.
Go ahead and talk.
Yeah, thanks. My job this morning is to put this into perspective, these times we find ourselves. What I'm going to explain to you is the age of economics. Now, as we go through this, I'm going to throw up a bunch of slides about economics that you don't have to retain. I'll download this and for Dennis and for you, and you can get them if you want. You don't even have to take a lot of notes. You just have to remember a couple of things. Our purpose as Christians is to advance the kingdom. Now, the Great Commission, and speaking the truth and the good news about Jesus Christ, of course, is the core of that. But this is all about preparing as many souls as possible to make the right choice for eternity. That's what we're here for. Now, in this process of how we're going to manage this system and help them in that is our job as Christians to explain to them the hope of the kingdom in these times. So that's number one. Real simple. Number two, then, let me give you just about 3 points after about 40 minutes. My hope is that I'm going to get through this. I'm going to explain a little bit of the history of how we got here, how we find ourselves in this situation economically. And then what's happening. The elections of Donald Trump in 2016 are not by accident. What does that mean to us in this time? And then 3, what to do about it. And I hope to close with enough time for questions and answers, Dennis. I want a conversation with you today. I don't want to just lecture, and that's not my job today. My job is to give you the facts and the background that you need to feel confident and comfortable in what you're getting ready to engage in the advancement of this kingdom through the Statesman project. Okay, so given that, let's proceed. Now, what I want to do is put on the whiteboard, just as you're thinking this through, the whole purpose of the exercise is kingdom advancement. That's all we're talking about here. And the times that we find ourselves in these times, is the age of economics. Okay, thanks. Good. The age of economics. Just keep those 2 things in mind, and I'm a lawyer by trade. Possibly should have been a doctor because I write like one. But let me put this on a little timeline, and I haven't done this before in a presentation, and I'm not trying to do it now to the point that this is an lesson in eschatology. This is more my opinion on history, world history. So if you have a line of nations, and I'm going to lay these out from ancient Israel to the United States, and I call that the axis of civilization. In other words, you're on that line. If you're a country or a kingdom that's on that line at any time, you are the center of the known world. Now, there are other things going on we'll talk about. But if you start with ancient Israel, then Egypt, and this isn't just necessarily chronological. This is, for me, biblical more than anything else. Greece, Rome, the Holy Roman Empire, Europe, and the United States. 7 kingdoms on a line. Yes, there was China throughout history. You've had Japan as an influence in their regions. You've had Persia. It could be going back to ancient Babylon. But they are never quoted as the basis of anything in world civilization today. Language, other things. Now, what's interesting about this is there's 7 of them. And 7's completion in the Bible. And the thing to remember about the bookends, Israel and the United States, is that God was present in the existence of both countries. In Israel, we learned that He is supreme. And his laws are absolute. And each one of these, let me just frame that first. And in the 10 Commandments, what's the first commandment? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Okay? The United States of America is the only country. Oh, wow, thanks. You guys are really taking care of me here. Well, thank you. United States of America is the only country in the history of the world. Now think about that a minute. That was established on the premise that God is sovereign over man and man is sovereign over government. That was the premise. And I think it's a nice bookend for the 7 countries because it starts with God. And today's subject isn't I believe on each one of these we learn something about how to live in the kingdom. There was good and bad about Egypt, collective farming, but a Pharaoh, so on and so forth. Greece, city-states, Rome, laws. You can go through this, and not today's presentation. This is all about learning to live in the kingdom and eternity and peace with God. That's why we're here. That's the purpose of time and eternity. Now, where are we in this design? Let me put it down around a board space. But if the kingdom is where we're going to get, this isn't eschatology. This is not my background, and I defer to Dennis on this when he speaks to it. But we're all seeking this kingdom. Now, there is Rick Joyner is head of Morning Star Ministries, and is a prophetic minister. He wrote The Harvest, if any of you have read that book. He has a piece out saying that we are now in the economic age, and boy, it just hit my spirit. That's exactly right. And the first age was military. And most conquests, this is God, and He's turned it back over to Israel. And what did the people of Israel say? You got God living with them. What are they asking for? A king. He said, you won't like it. And that was the first example of how to live in the kingdom. So first was military. It actually takes it over to Rome, middle of Rome. Crossing, these things all cross over. The next was religious. Age. That takes it past the Holy Roman Empire. The next is political. That's Europe and the EU over to the United States. And now we're in this last age, which is economics. 2 things about this. You see how it tightens from the beginning? Each line is shorter to the end. Now, in the end times, whatever they are, I don't know if it's tomorrow or 100 years from now, but there will never be another nation on this line of the axis of civilization. If there is, it's a one-world government. I can't see it. All land is settled. All countries are developed to some extent. And there's your line. And here we are in this time of economics. Now our job, my job, your job, is from here to here, is to give everybody a chance to make the right decision to save their souls based upon what's coming. Now, what is the definition of an age? Rick believes that those ages are the four winds of the earth being held back in Revelations. That the first wind was the military, second was religion, political, and now we're in the economic age. And that this wind will be held back until we're ready, or until God's time, which none of us know. And the point of it is this: if there's another conflict, if there's another catastrophe, if there's any turbulence in the system of civilization, it will be triggered by economics, not by military, not by religion, not by politics. That's the idea of the age. Now, so as we go through this, keep in mind this is what we're seeking for everybody: the kingdom and its advancement in this age. Go with this again, of economics. Now, as I go through some slides and explain where now you know the age, you know why why this is probably, well, not probably, exactly what God intended. I want you to. I'm going to close with this comment, so I'm going to start with it, so you'll be thinking about it. There's no reason to be anxious. There's nothing to worry about. God's got this. Number one, right? All you have to do first is make the decision to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior. That's number one. You got to believe. Two, and this is sometimes the hardest part for humans, trust God that He's got this. And three, be obedient to your skill set to engage in the economic age to help people understand this to save their souls. Believe, trust, engage. And engagement is obedience. Obedience to your individual call. We're all different. We all have different skills, education, background, cultural background, geographic background. The kingdom of God is a worldwide kingdom. It's not the United States of America. Now, as we're going through this, as we're trying to make decisions, then the last piece of good news, there are solutions. We could fix this in 48 hours. I'm serious. If everybody in the United States had the same attitude right now that those citizens in Houston had after the Harvey hurricane, we could fix this. We have the resources. We're not everybody's starving to death. Well, there's hunger in the United States, but there's not chaos out there. This isn't Rome in the pre-Middle Ages. But the secular answers are not going to happen. And part of our job, I think, in the lessons of the kingdom, are to show what could have been, what was, and if you're taking the best examples today, why this is the answer through God's laws. The 10 principles, Dennis, all the things, local authority, all the things that the Statesman's Project is presenting is based upon all of these lessons, of course, the Bible. Now, I do not believe it's by accident that you got Israel and the United States on the bookends, and right here is Rome, and this is when Jesus enters the equation. All time and eternity is based on the cross. Savior coming to the world and being saved. It's the entire point of the existence of this system of things. Free will, choose God, live in eternity as His friend. Now, if you look at this was the last time that the world was totally dominated by one power. They had all the marbles at the time. But they were missing one. Banking then was not, you didn't go to the bank and put your money in and negotiate an interest rate. The word bank actually comes from a Latin word. It means vault. And you took your money to a vault. You paid somebody to hold your money while you went on a trade route or whatever, so somebody wouldn't steal your goods while you were gone. That's how it started. Not like banking today. And second, currency was not what it is today. They didn't have a Federal Reserve. There wasn't paper. Well, there wasn't paper currency. It was coin. But it wasn't based upon some sort of a system I'm going to tell you about here in a minute that's got our banking system and currency systems so skewed. But otherwise, militarily, government, knowledge, power, and authority was Rome. Now today, in these times, is the USA, which is the end example of the 7 nations with the center of the universe on what we're supposed to do in the kingdom. The United States of America has all the marbles. And I don't believe that happens by accident. How else could it happen? It wasn't because we were so smart. We're the world's largest banking system. We're the world's largest economy. But here's we've known that. World's largest military. The only international military that can strike anywhere in the world at any time. The only one. The only worldwide Navy. The only worldwide Air Force. Now, can we strike everywhere at once? No. But we can strike anywhere once. And we are what's holding the world together. I keep looking at my watch here. I'll digress. I'm going to keep us on time, Dennis. Look, we are serving the world and providing a great service through our military. If the United States pulled back to its borders, the world would literally fly apart. India, Pakistan, the Middle East, China, Taiwan, Russia, the Balkans. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The deterrent of rogue nations, which most are, by the way. You get much past the G7, Great Britain, France, and Germany, Italy. You get much past that. Everybody's working in their own self-interest, not in global interest. And without the United States of America as a deterrent, it would literally fly apart. So we're benevolent in our power, which Rome wasn't. But the last thing is our currency. We are the world's currency. Let's talk about that just for a second. In China today, I did represent China at one time. I did, I reported to Xi Jinping and Deng Xiaoping at the time. And I had this argument with Deng Xiaoping that the system that they were setting up would not work economically. It's a communist system. It commands an economy. It says this is what we're going to develop in the next 5 years, goods and services, work projects. And the people of China will use it to maximum efficiency. It doesn't work that way, guys. It's called free enterprise. The people decide. And that's God's plan, that collectively in the wisdom of the people is the answer if you're obedient to God's rules. When you're not obedient to God's rules, that's when you get out of whack. Now, so they print money to fund those plans, and then when the plans go bad, what happens to the money? Well, they just kind of push it off the books. They ignore it. And therefore, no one today knows exactly what that yuan, which is their currency, is worth. And in my opinion, it's untradeable. It can't be recalibrated. It can't be part of a free exchange system. That's what I told him. And his comeback to me was, but the Chinese people will do what I tell them. I said, well, that may be, but the world won't. And when you grow out of your banking system, you can't tell the United States what to do. And he basically just said, well, we're going to agree to disagree. This is what we're going to do, because they were communist. It's also an Asian mindset, not to let things go to the people to make those kind of decisions, right? And they had made the decision that communism didn't work economically, and not that in today's discussion, unless you have a question about it, but they were very close observers of the Soviet Union when it collapsed. And Deng Xiaoping was ahead of the curve that Gorbachev wasn't, and made some decisions to reopen the Shanghai Stock Exchange, which was my job, to establish a federal banking system for wiring of money. You couldn't wire money into China until 1994. Think about that. It wasn't that long ago. You couldn't wire money into Russia in 1991 when they collapsed. There was no international banking system. Now well, anyway, not to get off on that, but they were close observers of what Gorbachev did, and then the argument I had with them was their Federal Reserve, which they didn't buy my argument, and I believe today it has roosted, it has manifested, and they're in crisis. The yuan is in free fall. The dollar, they can't keep dollars. They've had to pass laws to make it illegal to take dollars out of the country. So just think about the common sense of that, ladies and gentlemen. If you're 20% of the world's economy and nobody wants your currency, what does that mean? Doesn't make any sense, does it? Yet our leaders in Washington, D.C. aren't paying attention to it and still just kind of turn their heads. Well, if we can keep this going, somehow it'll all work out. It's not going to. Now, we could course correct this by balancing our budget, by living within our means, and actually managing our economy and our currency in a biblical manner. But there's no indication that's going to happen. And so it's coming to a head. I can't tell you when. When we get to the questions and answers, you can ask, we'll talk about it. But I'm just telling you that I have the exact same position today that I had in 1991 with Deng Xiaoping. This will not ultimately work. And that's where we are. Now, one last thing as we're going through this on U.S. currency. Remember the gold standard in the Middle Ages and the king and the alchemist, and they were trying to figure out how to manufacture gold? Why? Because if you could make gold, you could control the world's economy. A little oversimplification, but basically the concept. Turn lead into gold and you're king of the world. Today, you know what the backup behind the Chinese yuan is? It's the U.S. dollar. It's traded in a basket of funds called SDRs. And I don't understand why they do this, why the International Monetary Fund and its leaders, Uli can address it when he gets up here. What are they thinking? What is their strategy? But by what purpose do you just move them along, Uli, and then hope that somehow this all works out without giving them the guidelines they need to reform their banking system? But here's the point. For the Chinese yuan to be tradable in an international basket of currencies, they are supposed to keep $2.71 trillion on reserve at any time. Now, we don't think they've got it, but how would you know? But still, that's the point. If they say they've got it, okay, then the world just everybody just kind of rolls along believing the smoke and mirrors out there. That's kind of where we are in this age of economics. But think about that for a minute. The Chinese have to keep 2.71 trillion and be able to prove it at any given time. Guys, that's the gold standard. That's just the dollar replacing the gold standard. And we can print it. That's why we have all the marbles. We are in a position today in the United States that if we want to destroy a country, all we have to do is turn our economic guns to them and say your transactional cost to get in and out of dollars is 1% more than your neighbor. And they collapse. Now, there'd be repercussions from that. If you did it to one country, then there'd be alternative currencies, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But we have an enormous responsibility, the United States of America, for God's kingdom worldwide, is my point. Now, why was Rome not just the center of the universe on the axis of civilization when Jesus came to power? But why does the United States in these times have all the marbles? It can't be by accident. So one of the questions we've got to continue to ask ourselves as Christian leaders is, what does God want? What does he want us to do with this? How do we manifest his glory? How do we bring glory to him and explain all of this system of things to the point of the kingdom so people can make the right decisions? Okay? And I believe one of the examples is that Jesus comes to power at a time when this is absolute military control. And did it have any impact on his ministry? No. Was he able to do anything he wanted to do? Of course. He's God on earth. And so in these times, it'll be the same way. But if we're not careful and we don't handle our gifts any better than Israel, there'll be consequences. But still, this is where we find ourselves. So you ask yourselves that question. All right. Now, do you kind of see how this is how I see the purpose of this system of things that got us to this age of economics, and here we are right here in this line, and what we're going to do with it. Okay, the world of economics and political outlook. I'm going to go through these slides quickly because I want to get to the questions. And the point of this isn't to, you don't have to retain any of this, because the bottom line is the world's in a mess because we're not following proper biblical principles on banking and currency controls. It's just that simple. We are deficit spending in the United States to a point that it's madness. Well, to me, it's madness. The debt of the United States is 110% of gross domestic product today. And we're adding more debt at a greater rate than the growth of the economy. So the debt is continuing to grow as a percent of assets. The debt of the United States today is as great as Greece's when it collapsed. Now, why can we still go on? Well, it's the elasticity of the expanse of our money. We're the world's currency. So we can print more and do more and buy more and leverage more just because of the size of our economy. The Greek drachma is not traded beyond its region. So They were held in their limits quicker than we will be. But I promise you guys, you cannot print and borrow forever. If you could, then you could produce prosperity in this system of things, and you wouldn't need God. All right, we've got a complicated system. There's the point of these slides is to point out the fact that you have capitalism and communism at work in the world today. I've talked about the Federal Reserve of China. Let me just get to the point of it. If you want any of these slides about why care about macroeconomics, I believe that the point of macroeconomics, and maybe in my mission, the phrase in the Revelations that has haunted me since I was about 18 years old is, in the end times, nations not knowing the way out. How do we provide services? How do we keep the doors open? How do we do anything to stay in power? Because their purpose is to stay in power. Okay, it's not for the good of the world, and they're not following the principles. So here we are, the world's economic systems. On one side, you have capitalism represented by the United States and China and Europe. This is about 80% of the world's economy above the equator in those countries. And, roughly equally split. And three banking systems. The United States and our Federal Reserve's a little different in Europe and their exchequers, but at least it's Western counting principles, double entry bookkeeping. If Europe spends money it doesn't have, it's accounted for. China spends money it doesn't have, it's not accounted for. It's that simple. But those are the three bookends. Here's the rest of the world that just, you can see what's below the equator, and it's about 15% of the world's GDP. So think about this. Of all the world, those three areas are 85, and the rest of the world is what it is. There is well, these are oil producers. There is a third world that 1 or 2%. This is all that Russia represents. It's basically an oil producer with the Middle East. You wonder what their impact is. Well, that's what it is. It's about 5% of the world's GDP, but it's a critical component. Now, so here they are collectively, if you want to look at that slide just for a second. And what's in conflict is the capitalistic system, the United States and Europe, and China. Now, if you can't calibrate their currencies, you can't have a free exchange rate, and we can never meld the Chinese communist system, banking system, into the world's banking system, what's going to happen? At some point, one has to be successful over the other. They can't coexist, ladies and gentlemen, not forever. You can't have this peaceful and have trade, because you don't know what the value of the goods and services are from the two ends of the world. And at some point, one has to win over the other into a one world economic system. It's the only possible conclusion. So in a capitalistic system, the government taxes profits, the government borrows deficits through T-bills. In a communist system, the government sets the targets, and so it works like this, just quickly. In a capitalistic system, we have freedom, we have free enterprise. You have a job. You pay taxes on your labor or your business. That tax is then used to run the government. If it's not enough, they borrow money through T-bills. In China, the Politburo, who we still don't know how they meet and how they pass laws, but they decide what the 5-year plan will be and the next year's budget. And then they delegate those costs down in the beginning of the year to the provincial leaders. It's an old warlord system. It's never been changed. It's just got a new name. So you're the head of the Shanghai, Nanjing area versus Hong Kong versus Tibet. There's actually 6 vertical lines, these guys. And they write a check to the federal government, almost like a lease payment. And that's their cost. Feds go about their business, provinces go about their business. And then what happens? They got to make up their money on the ground, and they're not going to do it. They're going to do it any way they can. That's why we can't enforce intellectual property rights laws, and that's why our systems can't be balanced. Okay, let me blow through this. This is a Fed balance sheet. Just shows you that the total as of January 2nd, 2008, the total debt on the Fed balance sheet was $940 million. Today it is $4.5 trillion. That's through quantitative easing and absorbing debt to keep banks liquid. Here's a China balance sheet. If you can read that, then come up and tell me how you did it. There's no double book accounting, just lines and numbers. You can't audit it. You don't know what where the money is or what currency, what assets are dead. And I was asked to write one of the briefing memos for President Trump before he met with President Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago. And I pointed some of these things out to him. And he found it interesting and delegated it over to Wilbur Ross. But I told him that when President Xi gets there, he's going to be asking you for help to stabilize his regime because they're having currency problems. And he said, really? I said, well, yeah, that's the deal. And sure enough, that's what they talked about. Now, I wanted them to push harder on banking reform. They didn't do it. But here's how this is Economist magazine. Chinese banks report financial information to the Chinese central bank based upon the government targets they have been issued. Now, think about that a minute. The government puts out, this is how the economy will work this year. And so now the information comes from the local central banks, and they tell them what they want to hear because they're afraid they'll get put in jail if they don't. So they don't have good data. We don't have good data. In the United States, a bank reports to the Federal Reserve demand for money that's there. It's called a free and open economy. We trust each of you to make your decisions how you're going to use your money. The bank reports it. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury is there to facilitate a free enterprise economy. When you're demanding more money, Uli will go through this with you. They create money. When there's not, they contract it. Because we believe, basically the people, but not in China. Okay. Just so you know some of these terms, measure of a country's health, its solvency. If it's you, it's debt to equity. For a sovereign nation, it's debt to GDP. Let's look at some assets here. The total assets, it's hard to calculate this, all the land and national parks and whatever, but the total assets of the world are somewhere around $370 to $570 trillion. The total liquidity of all stocks, bonds, and commodities in the world is $165 trillion, and total world debt today is about $74 trillion. That's about 120% of world GDP. Think about that. There are 191 countries recognized by the UN, about 182 in the World Trade Organization. Every single one of them deficit spends, except occasionally Switzerland, which Uli will talk about. That's the only country I can find that's balanced its books in the last 5 to 10 years. Every country is deficit spending and doesn't know what to do about it, and is soon not going to know the way out. This isn't just a U.S. problem. This is a world debt crisis. Okay, the United States, just roughly in 2010, its budget was $3.5 trillion on $2 trillion in income. Therefore, we're borrowing $1.5. You see the numbers. Of course, there was some extraordinary spending then, and left us with that. So here we are today. Current national debt of about $19 trillion. That's about $61,000 per person. And the national deficit's $100 to $160 million adults is about $6,000 per capita. That's basically what we're spending today that we don't have per person, about $6,000. And nobody knows how to cut it or how to restructure it. We're beyond tinkering on the edges, guys. It requires restructure, reform, and as Dennis would say, a total reset. So here's some examples of Greece, UK, and the USA. See, it's all here in the same numbers, just so you see what it is. This is a number that I'd like to show people. That horizontal line says average 4.2%. All you have to remember from that chart is that the cost of funds to the United States government, the greatest or the largest banking system in the world, on average since the Civil War, has been about 4.2%. That's the number you're trying to dial up. Money's not free, guys. And you can't have economic development without cost of funds. If you just keep your money. You don't give your money to somebody and say, gosh, I hope you give it back to me. There's an interest rate involved. And with these low interest rates, yeah, there's been some growth in the equity markets, but the bond markets are struggling. The Teachers Retirement Fund of New York that needs 4.2% in the bond market can't meet its annuity payments. Here's what the federal debt has done the last, see the lines on the end, 2006, 2013, and they continue to go up. This is a total, this is U.S. debt as a percent of the GDP, including just the annual federal debt. You see the numbers, how high it's getting. This is U.S. This is also U.S. debt. I'll show you some other countries. So this is total now. This is individuals, corporate, everything, not just the federal government. 380%. Velocity of money is down. Yes, the economy is growing, but it's not growing through the banking system to the extent that it's never really recovered from 2008. Not to the extent that you can grow through this stuff. Okay, so there's the world. Now, here we are, just so you can see the UK, same problem, 500% debt. Here's the Eurozone. Here's the US. Europe's in more debt than we are. Here's Canada, our great neighbor to the north, and our friends. They're in the same situation. Here's the private-public debt of all major countries. So let's look at that slide a minute. The red line, Canada, by the way, our brothers from Canada, you're doing better than we are. But you're still above the red line of what is considered reasonable. Now, as economists, we take these numbers and we're trying to figure out, well, Greece was 110 and it failed. What's the elasticity of money, the size of the economy? What can you do to wire around some of this stuff? And so it stretches. It's not an exact number that hit this wall. I'm going to show you here in a minute. But we know that when you get above 300% total debt, citizens, corporate, and otherwise, it becomes what we call an anchor on the economy. There's a guy named Fisher that did this stuff back in the 1920s that predicted the Great Depression. You can't just have debt and ignore it. It's there. It's part of your currency. It's part of if you could just print money and make wealth, you wouldn't need God. Or if you could just borrow it and ignore it, just keep printing money. See, it doesn't work, and we're into this denial. This is a chart that I put together sometime, and we're still in that period out there past 2012. I believe in 2012. What this basically means, this is a Milton Friedman analysis, basically. But what that basically tells you is why they came up with quantitative easing when they did. It was to back the interest rate off. That's basically what it was, keep the banks liquid, keep the interest rates low. And now they've hit that wall again in 2012, and they continue to deficit spend. Now they're trying to back off quantitative easing, but you've got to deal with the debt to do it. So the bottom line is that we've hit a debt wall. We're there, and we're living on borrowed time. Okay, I gave you the long-term treasury rate. There's just to those of you who have more interest, these are some things I can provide you with footnotes on what the characteristics of extremely over-indebted economies have done. Look, through all of this, guys, this is why I put this chart up. God has shown us all along here what debt, too much dependence on military, too much dependence on a God that's a Pharaoh, too much dependence on city-states. So there's a above line we learn from all these and a below line on every one of these kingdoms or these nations, sovereign nation states on the axis of civilization. And he's told us this. And here we are with all the marbles. So we've got all we need to know, starting with God is supreme, to what we need to know economically and in government to make all this work for the kingdom, and we're ignoring it. And throughout recorded history, here's a long-term treasury rate. It needs to be higher than that. Here's again a debt to the interest rate and what the average was, and you see in 1929 that first red dot. Anyway, all these signs are out there. I can't tell you when, I can't tell you how, and that's really not today's point. The point of going through this with you is that we've been through this before, we've learned the lessons, and are we going to deny God's laws or not? Now, what this all gets down to, and I get to the bottom of this, is we've got to reform the banking system by balancing the budget, or we've got to do what Uli's going to talk about that he's got as an initiative in Switzerland. We've got to do something about our currencies, and Doug Jaden's going to talk to you about the possibility for alternate currencies. And these things are coming, because you cannot take this stuff forever and ignore biblical principle. And the currency wars of the 1926 to 1939 didn't work. And this is back when we really didn't have a world economy. I mean, each country in the world in 1929 we were dependent upon each other for trade, but oil and agriculture and other things, you could still sustain yourself for basic services. You can't anymore. This example from the Great Depression is worse now. Oil rigs, storm forecasts. So this is stuff I get from the this has been out there for about 3 years now. Slower growth in emerging markets and a gradual pickup in advanced economies. And that's exactly what's happening. Why? You're a third world country or you're a developing country like Brazil. Your entire debt is denominated in dollars. And even though you got a peso as a national currency, you can't expand your economy because we're your currency. You can't borrow long term unless you're in dollars. You can't do a deal unless you got an exit strategy to get out in dollars. You're totally dependent upon us here at the end of this age. And how are we managing that? I mean, the example I use is think of a whip. This is the handle of a whip. And the base of it is the United States of America. The next is Great Britain, or maybe Germany, Great Britain, anyway, pick your country. So G7's on the whip. And then the G20 or China and Russia, and they're further out on the whip. And on the end out there is Thailand. And the United States does something like this, controlling all currencies. Well, depending on where you are on that whip, France complains every day. We can't import oil long term because you're not controlling and managing your currency properly. We got to get in dollars to buy oil and get back in the French franc. But what happens to that Thai baht at the end of the whip? It's just doing this. And that you can't stay in. There are times when you're in Thailand, if you're trying to borrow money locally, you got to get in and get out in a working day. You borrow it at 9 o'clock, but you got to be in dollars by 5 because you don't know what it's going to look like the next day. And this isn't just because they got all their complex problems with their culture and society. Okay, this is what's happening, and it looks like, okay, we're kind of making it. It's kind of tough. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're just getting through one more day. We're not, guys. This is not going to end nicely unless we get control of the situation. Okay. So what are the conditions? There's a catch-22 on interest rates. The yuan's overvalued. There's world economic growth that is not keeping pace with the need to borrow. The Eurozone is so far in debt now, they're totally dependent upon us to make decisions. Now one thing about Europe, these are smart guys. Europeans are smart people. The Germans are smart people. And they know what they have to do, and they're trying to compete. But their debt to GDP is greater than ours. And the euro is a tradable currency. The pound's tradable in this region, but not internationally like the dollar. Now, the point is this. They're sitting here in the middle. Remember the old chart. Who's going to win, China or the United States? And they've got their foot in both because they don't know what we're going to do. We're not being forceful enough in our leadership on that we intend to meet that goal out there by biblical standards and control our currency and balance our budget. So they're waiting to see because they have no way to work their way out of this. Okay, then I'll close on this part of the presentation with this. If this is a direct quote from the Economist magazine, and that symbol is their symbol. If hegemons are good for anything, it is for conferring stability on the systems they dominate. For 70 years, the dollar has been the superpower of the financial and monetary system. Despite talk of the yuan's rise, the primacy of the greenback is unchallenged. As a means of payment, a store of value, and a reserve asset, nothing can touch it. Yet the dollar's rule has been brittle foundations, and the systems it underpins is unstable. Worse, the alternative reserve currencies are flawed. A transition to a more secure order will be devilishly hard. That's the Economist magazine, the leading magazine of Great Britain. Direct quote. Couldn't have summed it up better, so I didn't. I gave it to them. That's where we are. Okay, now what's happening now? And, that's where I'm my time. I got 15 minutes, so I got to blow through this. Okay. The election of 2016 was an absolute miracle. It's another presentation I could go through with you. As you said, I have run national campaigns. I was senior advisor to both Bushes. I ran Pat Robertson's campaign for president. I ran the Republican Congressional Committee in the 90s cycle. I was Reagan's National Field Counsel in 1984. So I've had some up-close opportunity to observe this stuff. Okay, and I'm telling you, no one can explain Donald Trump in 2016 except it was a miracle. Okay, Lance Wallnau predicted it in April that he was going to win. Everybody thought he was nuts. He was the wrecking crew, wrecking havoc in the electoral system, and now he's God's man in office. So what's the main thing that comes from this? The great unraveling. That's the word I get in my spirit. Now, there's also a social, actually, I got this in a dream. And the word is donome. It's a French word spelled denouement, but donome. The unraveling of a complicated plot to its logical conclusion. And I believe what God has done is given us an opportunity. Now, picture this. Picture the world like this in your mind. And Martin Luther King talked about this, that the world was contained by evil forces of self-interest, that you could not talk about civil rights because everybody was bound in it, and everybody was afraid to loosen it because they didn't know where it would go. And he, through the love of Christ, was able, to his terms, to unbolt the shackles, to loosen it. He didn't break it, but loosen it. So the love of Christ could intervene, and we got the civil rights movement. Now what we have economically, now think about this. The world, there's 191 nations in the world. There aren't 20 that have any impact on it. And that's including China, Singapore, Malaysia, Austria, countries like that beyond the G20. Most countries are totally dependent upon some power in the world providing their goods and services or technology, all they need to run their country. Now, and think about that map with above the equator and below. But when you think about populations of the world, I should put that up there. You know, it's more equally distributed. Okay, now, given that, here's what's going on in the world. You've got this system and forces that want to turn the world into a one socialistic system where government is in control of all choices. I believe that's because it goes directly against God's premise and purpose of free will. That's what Adam's all about. That's what the original sin is all about. That's what this system of things is all about. Are you going to learn the lessons that I gave you in the Ten Commandments? And are you going to apply them today to make a choice to be in the kingdom? Because this is coming, guys. When it's all said and done, it's going to be absolutely clear that God's laws were eternal. And there'll be no question. That's what this is about. But right now, you got a bunch of countries that don't know what to do because of lack of world leadership. And so they're bound in these shackles of how to survive, and they're part of the deal. The corruption is rampant. If you include in the definition of corruption that you're getting some kickback in some way. Malaysia, Singapore, all these countries out there, to survive, they're doing what they have to do to not challenge China so they can just kind of get through their life every day. And therefore, you're bound. Donald Trump is loosening and unraveling that system. Even what he did just the last couple of days by cutting the deals with the Democrats. The Republican establishment is as big of the problem as the Democrats in Washington, D.C. They don't want change. And you know, I know some of these guys personally. I've not called them and talked to them, but how dare you leave Washington, D.C., take an August recess and not fix health care? I mean, in the name of decency, it's broken. So either you fund Obamacare or you repeal it and you replace it, but you don't just leave town knowing that 50 states next year are going to be facing budget crisis beginning in January. All right. So what do we get from this? All states are in a political identity crisis. What do I mean by that? I've never seen this before in 40 years of national politics. And whenever I see something I've never seen before, I pause and say, well, what does this mean? When I was working for Ronald Reagan, and there was great change coming in the country. We were change agents. We were Reagan Republicans. That meant we were for strong national defense, local control of schools, family values, states' rights, less taxes. Boom, that's it. Everybody knew it. I knew it. And you had an identity. Whatever. And the Democrats had one. No, they were something else. Today, there's not a political movement in any state that can say in a word what they are. And so I'm from Oklahoma, the reddest state in the country as far as votes for conservatives. But you wouldn't go around the state and say, what are you? And people would say, well, I'm a Trump Republican. Particularly after the deal with the Democrats. Therefore, there's an identity crisis, and people don't like identity crisis. We're tribal by nature, guys. And we belong to tribes, we belong to themes, we belong to like-minded groups, and that's biblical, going back to ancient Israel. But if you apply God's principles, the tribes work together versus, you get my point. Now, 50 states. Missouri, who's a moderate state, doesn't know what they are. Oklahoma doesn't know what it is. And the same problem on the Democratic side. There are no Democrats that will get up and say, I'm a Nancy Pelosi Democrat. They don't want to. So they're looking. Is it Elizabeth Warren? Is it Bernie Sanders? But my point is, we are in this unraveling, in this loosening now. We're in this time when we can maybe redefine some things. The 2018 elections are not going to be what people think. It's going to be about issues that I think maybe haven't even risen yet. I was appointed, I don't know if I told you this, Dennis, I didn't even know it. Speaker of the House of Oklahoma appointed me to a commission to go to Phoenix next week to start the process of a call to state conventions. I said, well, wait a minute, I didn't even know about this. And I said, well, you got to go. And I probably will, because, in 1785 was the first call for a constitutional convention. And only 2 states showed up. But the country's in chaos. They were shooting each other across borders. There's no central bank. It wasn't pretty from 1781 after independence to 1789. Then they called it again in 1786. It set the protocol. They got 5 states. And then they held the Constitutional Convention in 1787 after the premise had been set. So this is the point of the call next week, is to set the protocol and the outlines. If we called one, what would happen, and that's it. So, okay, now what's happening to fill the vacuum? Number one, the Statesman's Project. And I thank you all for being here. I commend you for your time, your effort, what you're going to do back in the communities. This is the only organizing group in the United States that I know of that's got a policy covered by prayer, citizens education application that you can relate to, and that I think maybe that we can expand. Convention of States, there's a lot of other cities organizing, like SALT, which is a group I'm involved with that trains young leaders, and then a new system of currencies is being developed, which Doug Jaden will address. Okay, let me close with this real quick, so I'd like to take a couple of questions. This is something that I have sent, actually a book I wrote back in 2008, 12 Steps for the Moral Imperative. First, you got to have knowledge. We're in anxiety. People want leadership. Pressures are mounting, and America has a crucial role to play for the survival of the world's kingdom. What are the solutions? An individual must take responsibility for their own future. Small business and family-owned businesses are a key. You must think generationally and not just selfishly about yourself, and support limited government to understand the security versus freedom balance and ratio. And before I go to the last slide, that security and freedom is something we do in national politics. Do you want more government or less? Do you believe in opportunity, which is your individual initiative, or do you want more government? But guys, it's the same thing spiritually. Do you trust God or not? Do you believe that you're supposed to adhere to these laws that were laid down in ancient Israel or not? Are we going to advocate that or not? And then the last thing of the steps is define yourself and your values, prioritize your issues, communicate your values, lead others in your sphere of influence, and then last but not least, trust in your faith. So let me close with this. Look, it's all about, in my opinion, this. This symbol is ours. And see, I can't even do it rapidly. This symbol means more than, well, it means everything. And Jesus Christ on it, we should put him back on it. But the vertical axis is God to man. These are the laws that are eternal. They're not to be violated. There's no compromise. God is sovereign. Jesus Christ is our Savior. That's the good news. The horizontal axis are your service for the kingdom. So you get up every day and say, God, is this in your glory from me to you? And this is, what am I going to do to advance that kingdom? Now, with that, I'll close with what I started with. It's real simple. We are in a mess because man, in his sins of the flesh, has relied upon this system of things rather than God. And that's the banking system. That's the currency problems you get. That's where we are. The answers are simple, really, if we'd all collectively address them. But we're not likely to. And therefore, in all this confusion and chaos, we as messengers of Christ have an obligation to lead people to the truth of Jesus and what this can mean for them in the end. Okay, guys. Thanks. Thanks for being here. Thanks. 5 minutes for a question or two.
Almost afraid to open it for questions. Please, no complex economic questions. That isn't going to help us. Anybody? Go ahead.
I thought I understood you to say we were running at 110% of GDP with debt, and then your graph showed like 400%.
Okay, it's a good question, and I thought about not putting all those graphs up because it's really not the point. That's federal debt only, federal government, which is really the currency, because they're borrowing the currency at cheap. It's just the federal debt. The 360% debt includes you and me and individuals, corporations, local debt. But that has a different impact. You and I can borrow money, but we're not impacting the currency when we do that. When the government borrows money, they are. Must have been.
Where do you see the BRICS banking system taking a role, if it, where it came from, where it's going? And I know there's a lot of tension.
Well, the question, where are the Brits in all this?
The BRICS.
Yeah, and the banking system. Well, a couple of things. One, the British system is the model. They developed it. They were the first world currency, and they're part of that European equation. I don't put them on the line by themselves because there was always France and Germany and somebody else that could counter them. But as far as a system and a world trade system, they were okay. So they're disciplined people. Brexit is going to have an impact on that. Their debt is greater than ours. They're beyond their elasticity of their currency to continue to run deficits before their interest rates go up. You can continue to run deficits, but your interest rates have to go up. You cannot hold them. And once they go up, I didn't put that chart up, but right now the federal government's borrowing at about 0.02%. I mean, less than 1 point blended rate, when it ought to be 4 to be in equilibrium. And so every point increase in our federal debt is about $800 billion to the deficit spending every year. So now you're in a catch-22 I put up there. They can't let the rates rise too fast because they can't afford it. And Brits in worse shape. But they're not going to, they can't be the answer to the world. Only we can. This is, in this age, guys, we're it. If we don't make it, the world goes dark. It's that simple.
I want to rescue us as a group because unless you've been involved in this stuff, this is mumbo jumbo. Interesting. Bottom line being everything that Mark has said. Let me ground this, if I may, for a moment. What does all this have to do with the Statesman? It has a lot to do with the Statesman, and we're back to his point. One of the key Hebrew words for work, avodah, is worship. I want to ground my sumo base for what is economics. Economics is the system that allows man to worship with the gifts that God gave him. Huge. All of this, how many of you recognize you just heard a good doctor's explanation of the health of the economic planet? All that stuff was diagnosis of where the system which allows human beings to labor, worship, he gave you a diagnostic set of tools to measure the possibility of humanity being able to use the gifts that God gave them to provide for themselves and their families. This is huge. If you don't understand this, you don't understand why this is spiritually critical. Because if the economic system, the currency banking system breaks down, man is not able to live in an environment where the gifts that God gave us are able to be applied in labor. Am I communicating? Now, the Democrats and the Republicans, because they don't understand the real value of labor from God's point of view, are not even thinking about the global consequences of what will this do to God's plan for humanity to reveal the gifts that He gave us in a provisional context. Raise your hand if you understand, why is a statesman involved in this, and what does this have to do with Jesus? Everything, because Jesus cares about employment. Because employment is the context in which the gifts that God has put into us are used and harmoniously combined. People find out, oh, you guys are into economics. Yeah, we're into economics because God loves work, and He loves people, and He wants people to grow spiritually through the manifestation of their gifts operating in choice and development. Now, our challenge is, and we're back to finding apostolic prophetic leaders in nations, our challenge is to get Christians who can understand what we're just saying right here, so they'll understand why this matters. Because 99% of the church is going to say, that's all really interesting. I don't know what it means. And what does that have to do with Jesus? It has a ton to do with Jesus. Because if you go back to Matthew 20 and the parable of the vineyard owner, he went back in to find unemployed people in the city 5 times, and there isn't one comment about his worrying about the value of the crop, but he saw men's souls rotting in unemployment. Are we breathing? So if you don't understand the context, even Marx, bless his pointed head, understood the value of labor, which drives me nuts that God allowed somebody like him to enter the vault of understanding that employment and labor is an essential part of the release of man's creativity in God. So there's a million things we could deal with in the Statesman in terms of political public policy, but we went right to the center of the watermelon, because that is the center of the watermelon. And the Bible addresses all the components of what is required to have just, stable currencies and banking so that man can collectively labor and release the gifts and the phenomena of God's giftment in giftment people. Does that help you? I don't want you walking out of here saying, wow, he's a genius, that's incredible, but what do that mean? It means exactly what we're saying. Work is worship. And God is looking for the church to wake up, get God's point of view about what that really means, and that is why they never will see us coming. Because the last place on the planet the politicians and the leaders of the world system are going to look for any solutions to that problem is us, which is why I love God so much, because He always shows up where He's least expected to make all the difference. Thank you, Mark. Amen. We're going to take a break and come back in Uli Korch. is going to continue the assault on your mind, all based upon what we just said, work is worship. Amen. You got 10 minutes.
Let it fall in this place, let it fall in this place like the rain, rain, rain. Let it fall.